So I'm starting to realize some people don't actually hate themselves, right? I think they just don't believe in themselves anymore, which sounds dramatic. I understand, right? But hear me out because whenever people talk about insecurity, they usually talk about self esteem, confidence, self love, the whole shebang, all that. And sure, some of that matters, but I don't know. I've met people who genuinely liked themselves, thought they were smart, thought they were capable, thought they had potential, and they were still insecure. That's the weird part. Like, if you ask them whether they're talented, they say yes. You know, if you ask them if they're capable, they say yes. If you ask them whether they could build a good life, they say yes, right? Then the moment they actually have to make a decision, they freeze. And I think that's that I think the reason is really, really simple, right? They don't trust themselves. That's different. You ever had that one friend who's always on the way, you know? Every friend group got one. You text them, you say, "How far are you?" They say 10 minutes. They're probably in the shower. 20 minutes later, they're saying things like almost there, right? They're still looking for their keys. 40 minutes later, now they're parking, right? Like, brother is still at a gas station buying a Gatorade at that time, right? At some point, you have to stop believing them. Not because you hate them, not because they're a bad person. They're still your friend. You just have to adjust. They say 10 minutes. You mentally translate it into 45. No emotion, no anger, right? Just pattern recognition. And I think that's what people's brain do to them. Every time you say, "Is this time I'm serious," right? Your brain is sitting there like, interesting. Oh, tell me more. Continue, right? Because it heard this speech already before. That's the thing nobody really talks about. Your brain remembers every abandoned promise, every single one. You forget, right? Your brain doesn't. You ever decide you're going to completely change your life at 11:30 p.m., right? That's when the best decisions happen, apparently, right? You just be laying in bed, watching self improvement videos, and then suddenly you're becoming a new person tomorrow, right? You got the whole plan already on deck, right? Like, you wake up at 5, do a little meditation, read 30 pages, start a business, learn a language, get in shape. You got a six pack now, you fix your sleep schedule, you're journaling, you're deleting social media, you becoming enlightened, right? You got the whole thing mapped out. And then you wake up, it's raining, and now we're negotiating. It's tough. It's a tough life out here, right? Because eventually your brain starts treating your ambitions like the same way you treat spam emails, right? You still see them, you just don't take them seriously. And before somebody says, "So what, people just need discipline?" No, not not exactly, right? I think people focus too much on discipline and not enough on credibility, That's the word, right? Credibility. Because discipline sounds cool, right? Discipline has aesthetics, discipline has motivational edits. Credibility sounds like accounting. Right, that's what I do. Nobody wants to hear about a credibility. I should know, right? But credibility might be the entire game, in my opinion. If you really think about it, if somebody kept making promises and never following through, would you really trust them? No, no, you wouldn't. Come on now. Obviously not, right? Then people spend 10 years disappointing themselves and wonder why every decision feels uncertain, right? Like what are we doing? I saw somebody recently buy a camera because they were trying to become a YouTuber, a social media influencer, and they were not trying YouTube, not learning YouTube, but becoming a YouTuber, right? That was the identity now. 2 months later, the camera was just collecting dust. Now they're studying real estate or something. I don't know, right? A few months after that, they're just talking about moving to the mountains and just living a simpler life, right? Then they're posting quotes about discipline, then entrepreneurship, and then spirituality, right? Like, brother, pick a save file, right? Pick a game, right? Like, mind you, I'm not judging, right? Well, life changes, right? People change. And I get it, but sometimes I wonder how much of that is growth and how much is distrust. Because if you don't trust yourself, every idea feels more believable than the current one, right? The current path feels boring. The next path feels like salvation, right? For about 3 weeks, then the cycle starts again, right? And eventually life starts feeling like you're constantly rearranging furniture in a house that you actually never lived in. You move the couch, you move the desk, you move the bed, you buy a new lamp, buy a new planner, buy a new notebook, buy a new identity while you're at it. Like, everything changes depending on the person and what decisions they make. And that's where it gets weird, because people think confidence comes from succeeding, I don't think that's true. I think confidence comes from evidence, tiny evidence, boring evidence, the kind of the kind nobody posts online about, You said you'd go to the gym, you went. You said you wake up earlier, you did. You said you'd make the phone call, you made it. That's it. That's the that's the whole thing, not inspiration, not motivation, but evidence. And the scary part is that evidence works both ways. Every time you follow through, your brain notices. Every time you don't, your brain notices that too, right? That's why some people can have all the talent in the world, and still hesitate before every decision. Because deep down, they're not asking, can I do this? Am I capable? Right? They're asking, can I trust myself to keep going once I start? And those are completely different questions, right? And I think a lot more people are struggling with the second one more than they realize, right? I think that's why overthinking is such a weird problem, right? Because people act like overthinking means you're thinking too much. I don't think that's true because you're just refusing to trust the answer. That's different. Like, imagine asking somebody the same question 50 times, Eventually they're going to get annoyed, right? They're going to feel bugged, right? Do you want pizza? Yeah, you sure? Yeah. You positive? Yeah. What about burgers? Like, brother, all these questions. Are you the police? Like, what's going on? All right. Like, I answered the question. Leave me alone. Right. And I think people do that to themselves all day. They ask themselves what they want, then get an answer, then immediately start cross examining it, right? Like, do I really want to do that? What if I'm wrong? What if there's something better? What if the future disagrees with me? What if this isn't my true calling, right? Now we're doing detective work on a thought that was perfectly clear 5 minutes ago. That's where it gets weird because eventually you stop making decisions. You start investing in them. You ever notice how many people ask for advice after they've already decided? That might be one of the strangest things humans do. Somebody says, "Should I quit my job?" Then spends 20 minutes explaining why they hate their job, right? Or ask things like, "Should I move?" Then spends 30 minutes explaining why they want to leave. They say, should I be posting videos?" Then proceeds to describe the channels they've been imagining for the last 2 years. Like, brother, right? Like, the verdict has already been reached. You're not looking for advice. You're looking for witnesses, right? You want somebody else to co-sign the thing you are already chosen, right? And mind you, everybody does this. Come on now. But everybody, because responsibility feels lighter when it's shared. You know, if five people tell you to do something and it fails, at least you fail together, right? But if you trust yourself and it fails, now you have nobody to blame, That could be scary, it could be really, really scary, right? So people slowly start outsourcing decisions. Little ones first, then the bigger ones, then eventually all of them. And social media made this way, way easier because now there's an unlimited supply of people willing to tell you what your life should look like, right? There's an unlimited amount, right? You know, every problem has a content creator attached to it. You want to know how to dress, right? Somebody got a guide. You want to know where to live, somebody got a guide. You want to know how to think, somebody got a guide. You want to know your purpose. Apparently 17 different people figured that out too. Right? Like, it's convenient, and look, I'm not saying advice is bad, you know? That would be stupid, you know? Advice is useful, learning from people is useful. The problem is when other people's opinions become louder than your own experience. That's when it gets nasty, right? Because now your life starts feeling like a group project, right? Everybody got editing privileges, your friends, your parents, the internet, the algorithm, the random guy with a podcast microphone, right? Everybody got a vote. It's a democracy now, right? Except except the person who's actually going to live with the consequences, right? Everybody got a decision except you. And that's kind of the part I keep thinking about, right? Because once self trust gets damaged, it doesn't stay in one area, it spreads. You stop trusting your goals, you stop trusting your decisions next, and then your instincts, and then your preferences. Now somebody asks you what you want, and now you genuinely don't know, right? Like, not because you're mysterious, not because you're complex, right? You've just spent years consulting everybody else first. I saw somebody spend 40 minutes deciding where to eat, right? 40 minutes, right? Not because there weren't options, there were too many options, right? We live in San Francisco. There's a lot of good eats, but every option needed validation, every option needed certainty, Meanwhile, everybody's hungry, we starving out here, right? The restaurant could have been picked by accident and nobody would have cared. But that's what distrust does, it inflates everything. Now a meal feels like a life decision. Now a city feels permanent. Now a hobby feels like an identity. Now a mistake feels catastrophic. Because when you don't trust yourself, every decision feels irreversible, you know? That's why people get stuck, not because of the lack of information, right? Most people are drowning in information, honestly. You can learn almost anything online now, right? The issue isn't information. It's the modern age, right? We're not going to libraries and picking up books just to learn, right? The issue is permission, right? You're waiting for certainty, waiting for confidence. You're waiting for something magical. You're waiting for some magical feeling that says, congratulations, right? You can proceed now, right? And I don't know, like, I don't think that feeling exists. I think most people who seem decisive are just willing to move before they feel ready. You know, that's it. That's the secret, right? Not certainty, not, yeah, not certainty, but movement. That, that reminds me of something else, right? I think a lot of people confuse preparation with progress, right? That's another big one, right? You ever buy a notebook and suddenly feel productive? You haven't written anything. The notebook is just sitting there, but somehow you already feel closer to your goals. And you spend you spend 3 hours organizing your workspace, cleaning your desk, buying new accessories, watching productive videos, downloading apps, color coding everything. The setup looks impeccable. It looks amazing, incredible, right? Very, very aesthetic, right? Nothing happened. The machine is polished, the machine is beautiful, the machine has not been turned on, right? And that's dangerous because preparation creates the feeling of completion, not failure, no embarrassment, no uncertainty, just the comforting illusion that you're getting somewhere, which is why people can spend years preparing for lives they never actually entered. And after enough repetitions, something starts changing underneath the surface, because every time you hesitate, every time you ask for another opinion, every time you postpone a decision you already know the answer to, your brain learns something. It learns that your judgment is negotiable. It learns that your instincts require approval, It learns that your desires are not enough. And eventually you stop treating yourself like a source of information, you know? You start treating yourself like a suspect, Every thought is interrupted, you know? Every ambition gets questioned. Every desire needs evidence, you know? And once that happens, the problem is no longer confidence. The problem is that you've forgotten how to take your own side. And maybe that's why so many people keep reinventing. They keep reinventing themselves. Not because they're growing, not because they're evolving, right? But because they're trying to escape a version of themselves they no longer trust. That's different because people always talk about identity like it's something you discover, you know, like it's hidden somewhere waiting. You just have to find the right book, the right philosophy, the right city, the right routine, the right aesthetic, and then boom, bada bang. Everything makes sense, right? I don't think I don't think that's how it works. Right? I think a lot of people are looking for a new identity because they don't trust the current one. You ever notice how often people start restart their lives? Not literally, but psychologically. You know, one week they're becoming disciplined, the next month they're becoming creative. Then they're becoming spiritual, then minimalist, then hyper ambitious, then detached, then healed, then mysterious, right? Then focused on themselves, right? Which is always funny to me because half the time when somebody says they're focused on themselves, they've spent the last 3 hours posting about it. Like, who are you informing? Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's the kind of that's kind of the point. People keep changing the character because they don't trust the actor. And every new identity feels like a fresh start. For a little while, then reality catches up because eventually the version of you has to start making decisions too. And if trust wasn't there before, it won't be there after the rebrand. And that's where I think a lot of self-improvement content accidentally misleads people. It convinces them they need a new system. They need a new mindset. They need a new morning routine, a new version of themselves, right? When sometimes the issue is much simpler, you know? You don't just believe your own word anymore. And all the optimization in the world can't fix that. Everybody talks about suffering, right? The tragedy, the loneliness, all that. Every change makes sense when it happens. Every transformation solves a problem, every sacrifice feels justified. Every new version seems necessary, And that's what makes it scary because there isn't one moment where everything goes wrong. It's gradual, one change, then another, right? Until eventually you look back and realize you've changed too much that the person who started the journey barely exists anymore. And I think people do that in real life all the time, not physically, but psychologically. You keep modifying yourself to solve problems. You become more detached because you got hurt, more independent because people disappointed you, more cynical because optimism embarrassed you, more guarded because vulnerability backfired, right? Every adjustment makes sense. Every adaptation has a reason. That's the scary part, right? You can lose yourself through logic. You can explain every step and still end up somewhere strange. And eventually the question stops being, am I improving? And it becomes, do I even know which parts of me feel real anymore? Right? That's the heavy question, right? I don't think enough people sit with that, right? Because modern life rewards constant reinvention. Everything says evolve, pivot, optimize, upgrade, rebrand, refresh. But sometimes I wonder if people need less reinvention and more continuity, right? Continuity, right? Less optimization, more consistency, less becoming, more remembering. Because if I'm being honest, right? I think a lot of people are exhausted, not from work, not from life, but from consistently renegotiating with who they are. Imagine having to interview yourself every morning saying, what do you believe now? Like, what are our goals? What kind of person are we now? That's exhausting. At some point, you just gotta, you just got, at some point, you just want solid ground, right? You know, something stable, something that doesn't need to be rediscovered every 6 months. And I think self trust might be that thing, not certainty, not confidence, trust. There's a difference, you know, there's a difference. And because confidence says, I know this will work, trust says, even if it doesn't, I'll handle it, you know, confidence says I'm right. Trust says I can survive being wrong. Those are completely different mindsets. And that's why people who trust themselves often look more confident than they actually are. They're not certain, right? They're just moving, They don't know what's going to happen. They simply stopped requiring guarantees before they act. And I think that's what makes distrust so dangerous, it quietly turns life into a waiting room, right? Waiting for certainty, waiting for clarity, waiting for permission, waiting for proof, waiting for perfect pain, the perfect opportunity, the perfect version of yourself. Meanwhile, years go by, and that's kind of what the realization that keeps bothering me, right? Because when people talk about being lost, they usually talk like they don't know where to go. And I don't think that's always true. I think a lot of people know exactly where they want to go. They just don't trust the person trying to get them there. That's different. That's way different. And maybe that's why some dreams never leave, some goals never leave. Some ideas keep returning every few months, right? Not because they're haunting you, like a ghost, right? But because they're waiting for you to believe yourself. And I don't know, maybe that's the real cost of broken self trust. It's not that you stop moving, it's that eventually you stop listening, you know? You stop You stop listening to things that excite you, the things that interest you, the things that keep showing up, the things that keep you alive, right? Because every instinct gets treated like a suspect. Every desire gets cross-examined, every ambition needs approval, and after enough years your voice starts sounding unfamiliar, not because it disappeared, right? But because you got used to hearing everybody else's voice first. And once that happens, you can spend your whole life searching for yourself, without realizing you're the actual one person whose answer you stopped accepting.